Have you ever wondered what really happens when the lights go out in a funeral home? If you believe the dead rest in peace, it's time to rethink everything you thought you knew. What I'm about to tell you will challenge every belief you have about the supernatural. These aren't just ghost stories. They're real, inexplicable experiences that took place in places where death should be the end. But it's not. Imagine stepping into a place where the darkness isn't just from the night, where shadows move and the dead might not be so dead after all. And what if I told you that the very people who work in these places feel the presence of something that shouldn't be there? Here's the kicker that no one tells you. The people who face what you're about to hear often never leave the same. You're about to see how far real fear can go, and why some mysteries can never be fully explained. Now, if you think this is just another ghost story, think again. What happened to these people might be far more real than you can imagine. Are you ready to hear what authorities have kept hidden about what really happens in funeral homes? What happened to Emily, for example? She never walked out of that place, or maybe she never walked out herself. And what about the things the others never told you? Stick with me until the end, because what you'll uncover will change how you look at life and death. Ready? Let's go. The funeral home, a place where the living bid farewell, and the dead quietly slip into eternity. But not all things in this world stay where they belong. Some things linger, trapped between realms, waiting, watching, calling. It was past midnight when Sarah, alone in the dim-lit halls of the old funeral home, began to feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The last family had left, their footsteps echoing as they disappeared into the night. The place was quiet now, too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts feel louder, like they were the only sound in the world. She made her way through the hall, the sound of her heels tapping on the hardwood floor, the only noise breaking the eerie stillness. She was used to this, used to the solitude of her late shifts. But tonight felt different. Sarah stopped in front of the embalming room. She could hear it again, the whisper. This time it was unmistakable. "Help me?" The voice was coming from within, but how could it be? There was no one there. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to catch any other sound. But all she heard was the hum of the refrigeration unit and the faint rustling of something, like breathing. Was it her mind playing tricks on her? The dark, lonely building, the constant presence of the dead? Or was there something else? Something that shouldn't be here? Something that wasn't ready to rest? As Sarah hesitated, a chill ran down her spine, and the whisper came again, but now it sounded different. It didn't sound like a plea. It sounded more like command. "Come closer." Her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but something about that voice felt wrong. Like it wasn't just a voice, but a presence. Something watching her, waiting. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple, and she turned the doorknob. The door creaked open slowly, the cold air inside rushing out like it had been waiting for her. But when she stepped inside, she felt nothing. The room was just as it had been, empty, cold, and silent. The body of the deceased lay on the table, its pale face illuminated by the dim overhead light. But for a brief moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw the body's eyes move, slowly, very slowly, just enough to make her question her sanity. She blinked, and the eyes were still. She took a step back, heart racing, and that's when she heard the sound, the softest, faintest rustling, like something dragging across the floor. The room was completely still. Was it the body? Was it the wind? Or was something else moving in the shadows? Her breath caught in her throat as the faintest whisper echoed through the room once more. "I'm still here." In a panic, Sarah turned to leave, But as she did, she felt the air grow thick, almost as if the room itself was closing in on her. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic. And then, suddenly, the lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the room into total darkness. Was she imagining it all? Or was something truly alive in this place, a presence that refused to be forgotten, trapped between the world of the living and the dead? Sometimes the mind can play tricks on you. The stress, the isolation, the darkness that fills every corner. But Sarah's experience was different. It wasn't just the shadows that moved in the corners of her vision. It was something else, something she couldn't explain. And as the lights flickered, she wondered, was it just her imagination, or was she truly seeing the dead? Sarah's story was far from the only one. As the whispers faded from the halls of the funeral home, another chilling account was about to unfold in a different part of the country. But this one wasn't from a young, wide-eyed attendant. It came from someone who had seen it all. James had been working as a mortician for over 30 years. His hands had prepared hundreds of bodies, and the smell of formaldehyde had long since lost its sting. He was used to the eerie calm of the funeral home, the late-night shifts, the solitude, but even he wasn't prepared for what happened one fateful evening. It started like any other day. The air was cool, the sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the funeral home stood in its usual quiet. James had been working alone for a while, getting ready for the next service. It wasn't uncommon for him to be the only one around at night. No one else ever volunteered for the night shifts. The silence had always been a comfort to him, a necessary part of his work. That night, though, something was different. James was preparing the body of an elderly man who had passed away earlier that day. The body was cold, stiff, and the usual work proceeded as normal. But as he looked down at the lifeless face, something caught his attention. The man's eyes, they weren't as still as they should have been. James blinked and looked again. No, it couldn't be. The old man's eyes had shifted, just barely. His left eye had moved slightly to the left. A subtle, imperceptible movement, but it was enough to make James freeze. He looked away quickly, tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, the body had been embalmed, the eyes had been closed. There was no way it could move. He took a deep breath, focused on the task at hand, and resumed his work. But the feeling of being watched crept over him, intensifying with every passing second. James had been in the business long enough to know that the dead didn't usually make their presence felt. But as he continued working, he heard something that made his heart skip a beat, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It was as if the very air around him was speaking. "I'm not finished." The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. He could feel his pulse race as the words echoed in his mind. He turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one. The room was still, silent. He stood there for a long time, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The room remained as quiet as ever. He was alone. The whisper had vanished. Yet the feeling didn't leave. James could still feel the weight of the words pressing on him, almost as if they were a warning. Something was off. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. James continued his work, finishing up with the body and preparing for the next service. But as he went to leave, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. At first, he thought it was just his mind again, the isolation playing tricks on him. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. James turned around quickly, but there was no one there. His heart raced as he stood frozen in place. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just like that. Was it a ghost? Or just his mind breaking under the weight of years of late nights in an empty building? James had been in the mortician business for over 3 decades, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Was it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or something more? Something darker? Some things linger after death, and sometimes they refuse to stay put. But the question remains, what happens when they're not ready to leave? The shadows in the corners of the funeral home were thick with secrets. But some secrets aren't meant to stay hidden for long. James' experience was only a glimpse into a much darker mystery that lay beneath the surface of this quiet building, and it would soon reveal itself in a way that no one could explain. It wasn't long after James' unsettling encounter that a new attendant, Emily, started her shift. She had been warned about the place, the strange stories, the eerie happenings, but she was a practical woman, not one to believe in ghosts or spirits, or so she thought. Her first night alone in the funeral home was relatively calm. The building was as quiet as any other, save for the hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. She moved through the rooms, preparing for the next day's services. But as midnight struck, the atmosphere changed. The silence became almost oppressive, like the building was holding its breath. Emily was making her way down the long hallway when she felt a sudden chill sweep through the air. It wasn't like the usual cold of the building. It was a biting, unnatural cold, like stepping into a freezer. She paused, looking around, but saw nothing. Just empty rooms, long hallways, and the soft ticking of the clock. But then she noticed something. At the far end of the hall, in the dim light of the corridor, she saw the outline of a figure standing motionless. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps her mind playing games after a long shift. But the figure didn't move. It was tall, unnaturally still, and completely silent. Emily's heart started to race. She couldn't see the face, but she could feel its gaze, intense, heavy, like it was watching her. And then, as if to prove her thoughts wrong, the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her breath caught in her throat. She froze, not knowing whether to run or stay. The figure stepped again, and then it was gone. No sound, no footsteps. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Emily blinked, unsure if she'd imagined it. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, but when she turned to leave, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The door to the chapel was wide open, even though she was certain she'd closed it earlier. She had walked down the hall just moments before and it had been shut tight. Now, the chapel was invitingly dark, its interior bathed in an eerie, pale glow. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, like something was waiting. With cautious steps, Emily approached the chapel. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she entered, her breath shallow. She scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the rows of empty chairs. But then she saw it, a figure, sitting at the far end of the chapel. It wasn't a person, though. It was a shadow, blacker than the darkness around it, unnaturally still, like a part of the room itself. Emily's heart raced, her feet refusing to move. Was this another illusion, or was something truly there? As she stood frozen, the shadow seemed to grow, stretching across the floor toward her, inch by inch. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The shadow inched closer, until it was just a few feet away, its presence pressing down on her chest. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Emily's blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't human. It was deeper, more resonant, like the very walls of the chapel were speaking. Her body refused to obey her commands, and all she could do was stare at the shadow as it loomed closer. What was the shadow in the chapel? Was it something that had always been there, lurking in the dark corners of the funeral home, waiting for the right moment to show itself? Or was it a manifestation of something far darker, a presence tied to the building's troubled past? Emily had no answers, only a lingering feeling of dread that would follow her long after she left that night. And for those who stay in this place, it's always the same. The shadows never stay still. They move, they grow, they wait. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as the shadow closed the distance between them, its form stretching unnaturally across the chapel floor. The whispers, once a faint murmur, now seemed to vibrate through the very walls, as if the building itself were alive. She tried to move, anything, but her legs were frozen, locked in place. Her heart raced, each beat echoing louder than the last, until it felt like her chest might burst. The shadow was so close now, its presence suffocating, pressing down on her like a physical weight. And then, just as the room seemed to close in around her, it spoke again. "You shouldn't have come. This place never lets you leave." The voice was low, resonant, like it came from the very bowels of the earth itself. Emily's throat went dry as she struggled to breathe. She felt her body tremble, the sensation of being trapped overwhelming her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Suddenly, the shadow receded, pulling back as if it had been called away by some unseen force. The oppressive air lifted, and Emily felt herself exhale a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The chapel was silent again. The figure had disappeared, but the unease remained. Emily's legs gave out as she collapsed to the floor, her mind racing. What had just happened? Was it real, or had she simply lost her grip on reality? She scrambled to her feet, looking around one last time to be sure she wasn't imagining it. As she hurried toward the door, she noticed something that chilled her to her core. The photograph on the wall by the exit, the one she'd passed a dozen times before, now showed a different face. It was her face. She stared at it for a moment, unsure what she was seeing. The image in the frame was unmistakable. Her, standing in the chapel, exactly where she had been moments ago. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back, her hands shaking as she reached the door. But when she opened it, the hallway outside wasn't the same. The walls were cracked, the air thick with a strange, musty smell, like something that had been locked away for years. She stepped into the hall, but it didn't feel right. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, too slow, too deliberate. And then, through the darkened hallway, she saw it again. The figure, the same shadow, now standing at the end of the hall, its outline barely visible in the dim light. But this time, it wasn't just watching her. The shadow moved faster than she could comprehend, and before she could react, it reached out and touched her arm. The cold seared through her skin, burning deeper than any frost she'd ever known. Emily screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence that followed. The funeral home was quiet again. The lights flickered, then went out. No one saw Emily leave that night. Her shift was supposed to end at dawn, but when the morning staff arrived, they found the funeral home just as it had always been, empty, cold, and silent. The doors were locked, the rooms untouched. But Emily was gone. The question remains, though, what happened to her? Did she simply leave in fear, haunted by the night's events? Or had the shadow claimed her as its own, pulling her into the darkness where the living are never meant to go? The funeral home still stands, just as it always has. But if you walk by it late at night, and if you listen closely, you might hear something faint whispers in the air as if someone or something is still trying to call you inside. The shadow never really leaves. It waits, just behind the walls, in the quiet corners, waiting for the next soul to walk through those doors. And when they do, they never really leave.